That's Professor Somadoda Fikeni. Good afternoon, Prof, and welcome to the SABC News Desk. Always a pleasure to have you with us.
Good afternoon, and thanks for inviting me.
Professor, what do you make of this year's manifesto? Is it enough at this juncture to win back the hearts, minds, and more importantly, the votes of South Africans, especially those who feel disillusioned with the African National Congress at this juncture?
Well, I would start even before the manifesto, the campaign in KZN, which was seen as a problem, a province with divisions, as well as a province which was a stronghold for former President Jacob Zuma. I do think that that symbolism was enough to send a signal to the rest of the country's ANC constituency to say that every effort is made to bring in divided sides. The second part is the focus on the economy. And that in itself, I do think that it is going to have an appeal because all parties will focus on economic issues, but the biggest test is credibility and capacity to implement.
Speak out against civil servants, and among them some of our political leaders who allegedly loot and use public resources for their own self-interests or gains. One wonders how the new administration will address this public sector corruption that's become so rife, which has spread across the state now, including our provincial governments and key public institutions.
I do think that the process is already underway, where you have seen some of board members and executives removed from the state-owned companies on the basis of mismanagement and fraud, as well as the current process of the State Capture Commission will send a signal that even the most senior will not escape. You saw in the aftermath of VBS Bank scandal that many mayors and many executives did lose their jobs, and that happened so swiftly in comparative terms than the previous years, when a person would say, I'm waiting until court processes take years before I leave.
Professor, we also heard President Cyril Ramaphosa earlier reiterate again and again calls for unity within the organization. How do you think he will balance this need now to maintain cohesion and unity within the party, and with the need to install a new cabinet which can instill confidence within South Africans and both local and foreign investors at this point?
I do think that the first step is to make sure that in his cabinet, in the premiers, people are simply selected on merit, as well as, of course, the support they have, instead of saying which slate they belong to. If he were to do that, irrespective of whether a person had supported the former President Jacob Zuma or Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, as long as they do not have any corruption directly linked to them, then that in itself will go a long way to send a signal that only merit and the fact that you belonged to one faction or another, you supported this or that leader, will no longer matter. The second one would be to make sure that even those areas which are constituencies which did not support him, he makes sure that services are given to those areas so that there is not a slightest perception that you do have any area punished because of their political allegiances in the past. And of course, he also has a big task of making sure that those who were disaffected, those who were left behind, like the alliance partners, the ANC veterans, and some of the stalwarts of the ANC are brought into the fold. They belong, they have a meaningful participation role.
Professor, plans to create more jobs and ensure that all workers earn a decent living really at the center of this manifesto. And of course, usually after manifesto launches, we have a honeymoon period of great heightened public and investor confidence. But can our president, do you think, keep the momentum going until elections in April this year? And then he also must do the work or lay the groundwork in policy for a new economic plan or trajectory that will tackle inequality and tackle unemployment and poverty.
He can try to do that, but he has to be very honest that the fiscal constraints at the moment do not allow for the largesse of giving out and doling out things merely because elections are coming. He has to be honest that to people these are processes which will take longer, and the structural and deep problems that the country is facing socially and economically, it's not the kind of thing that you're going to do overnight. If he were to be honest in that sense and then lay out the plan with timelines, but most important was the reference to the public service, because any plan is as good as its capacity to implement. If you do not have that capacity, then we might as well see the plan as no more than a theoretical reference frame.
Professor, the President also mentioned nation building and social cohesion. And as per the National Development Plan 2030 vision, it states that South Africans by then will be more conscious of the things we have in common than our differences. Is this being overly ambitious, because 2030 is less than 12 years away? Is all this achievable by 2030, or will South Africans reach a point where apartheid is no longer a part of our living memory, and to what extent will this aid social cohesion?
Well, I do think that we have to be realistic as South Africans about how difficult such journey is, because no other country, America had a declaration of independence which made all kinds of promises, the freeing of slaves, the civil rights, which were passed decades ago. They still have moments where you see that racism and divisions are still deep, so sometimes you do have regression. Australia with the Aborigines and so on, you can look around the world. So the notion of South African exceptionalism, thinking that we could turn things around and the legacy of apartheid and colonialism will have been wiped out within a decade, is not a possibility. But what is most important is whether we're putting the fundamentals in place, especially changing the socio-economic geography, which is still very much showing the signs of the legacy of the past, and beginning that journey. That to me would be the most important thing than the magical turnaround. But at the same time, a decisive visionary leadership can rally a country. Rwanda was a country of genocide in 1994, and today in some developmental spaces, Rwanda is beginning to take some interesting lead within the continent. So if you are able to have capable leaders in government, in the private sector, in the civil society, amongst the trade union movements, youth formations, women's organizations, then you can begin to rally the great potential of this country forward.
Professor Somadoda Fikeni joining us there from our Pretoria studios. Thank you so much for sharing those invaluable insights on the ANC's new political manifesto. Your time is much appreciated here on the SABC News Desk. Let's move on now. The SACP General Secretary Blade Nzimande has called on the ANC to unite its alliance members. He addressed thousands of ANC supporters at the party's election manifesto launch in Durban.